The body's eyes followed me across the cemetery, 3 hours after the doctor pronounced him dead. Tonight, 12 Catholic priests will share encounters that forced them to question everything they believed about death, salvation, and what lies beyond consecrated ground. By the end of these testimonies, you'll understand why some of these men left the priesthood forever. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because what you're about to hear is real. Now get ready, let's start story 1, and if you're already scared, I feel sorry for you because now you're going to die of fear. I never believed in ghosts. 20 years in the priesthood, countless confessions, and I dismissed every supernatural whisper as grief or guilt, playing tricks on fragile minds. That certainty died at St. Agatha's Chapel on a fog-choked October night in Charleston, South Carolina. The abandoned church had been closed since 1952, its congregation scattered after what the records called unexplained disturbances. But Father Brennan's call that evening carried something I'd never heard in his voice before. Genuine terror. "Michael," he whispered into the phone. "The confessional at St. Agatha's. It's still taking confessions." And the fog rolled thick around Charleston's old stone walls as I approached the ruins, my breath forming ghostly puffs in air that shouldn't have been so cold. October in South Carolina was usually mild, but the temperature around the chapel felt wrong. Not just cool, but hungry, as if the very air was feeding on warmth. Inside, the atmosphere changed completely. The moment I crossed the threshold, my lungs felt heavy, each breath requiring effort. The air was thick with decades of silence, weighted with memories that refused to die. Broken pews lay scattered like fallen soldiers, stained glass windows gaped with jagged holes. Yet in the center of all this decay stood something impossible. The confessional booth was pristine. Dark oak gleamed despite decades of neglect, its intricate carving sharp and clean as the day they were finished. The heavy curtain hung undisturbed by time or vandalism, its deep burgundy fabric somehow untouched by the dust that coated everything else. I ran my fingers over its surface, expecting it to splinter under my touch, but it felt solid, unnaturally preserved. That's when I heard it. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned, and I cannot die." The voice seeped through the wooden slats like water through a cracked dam, ancient, desperate, carrying the weight of decades. My stomach tightened as the air grew heavier, pressing against my chest like invisible hands. This wasn't some teenager playing elaborate pranks. This voice carried something old, something that had been waiting far too long. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible even to myself. Silence swallowed my words. Instinctively, my hand gripped the rosary in my pocket, the familiar beads offering little comfort against whatever presence filled this ruined sanctuary. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees, and my breath began forming visible clouds, despite the lack of any natural draft. Before I could step back, the confessional door swung open with violent force, sending dust spiraling into the moonlight streaming through broken windows. The hinges creaked in protest, a sound like screaming metal that echoed through the empty space. What I saw inside that booth changed everything I thought I knew about death, salvation, and the boundaries between worlds. A figure knelt in the shadows, bound in chains made entirely of rosary beads. Its skeletal frame was draped in rotting vestments, and its face, God help me, its face was nothing but bone and shadow. Empty sockets where eyes should have been somehow bore into me with impossible sight, studying me with an intelligence that had survived death itself. "I have waited so long," it whispered, reaching skeletal fingers through the shadows toward me. The rosary chains clinked like shackles with every movement, each bead catching what little light penetrated the booth's darkness. That's when the screaming began. The scream wasn't human. It wasn't even a sound in any normal sense. It was weight, pure and terrible, pressing against my ribs like a physical force trying to crush my lungs. The unearthly wail poured from the figure's gaping mouth, an unnatural resonance that filled the chapel like rolling thunder during a summer storm. The walls groaned under the assault. The remaining wooden pews creaked and shifted on their own, grinding against the stone floor with sounds like breaking bones. The very air vibrated with frequencies I had no words for, making my teeth ache and my vision blur at the edges. I staggered backward, my hand tightening around the rosary in my pocket until the beads cut into my palm. My mind fought desperately for rational explanation, hallucination, stress, some kind of elaborate hoax, but my body knew better. The cold sweat beading on my forehead, the tightness in my throat, the way my heart hammered against my ribs like a caged bird. These weren't the responses to imagination. The figure lurched forward, bound in its rosary chains, the beads clinking together like medieval shackles. With each movement, the chains seemed to tighten, cutting deeper into what remained of its neck and wrists, leaving marks that wept something darker than blood. "Absolve me," it begged, its voice layering over itself as if 100 different souls spoke through one ruined mouth. "Let me go. Please, Father. Let me go." I had performed countless confessions throughout my career. I'd heard sins that made my stomach twist. Adultery, murder, betrayal of the deepest kind. But this was different. This wasn't confession. This was condemnation pleading for release from bonds I couldn't understand. My trembling hand formed the sign of the cross, muscle memory overriding terror. "Te absolvo," I began, the Latin words feeling foreign on my tongue. The moment those sacred syllables left my mouth, the chapel exploded into chaos. The remaining stained glass windows shattered outward in a symphony of destruction, colored shards catching moonlight as they rained onto the grass outside like fallen prayers. The wooden pews slammed against the stone floor with thunderous crashes, the ancient foundations shaking as if the earth itself recoiled from what was happening. But the figure's scream changed, not pain now, but pure, undiluted terror. The rosary chains tightened around its neck with violent force, yanking it backward into the confessional's shadows. Unseen hands seemed to be dragging it away from the absolution I'd tried to grant, pulling it back toward whatever hell it had been trying to escape. Its bony fingers clawed desperately at the wooden panels, leaving deep gouges in the polished surface as it fought against the invisible force. The empty sockets fixed on me with wild desperation, and for one terrible moment I saw something almost human in that skull. Fear, genuine fear of whatever was reclaiming it. "You don't understand," it rasped, its voice breaking like dry leaves. "You don't know what you've—" The confessional door slammed shut with finality that echoed through the chapel like a coffin lid closing. The sound cut off its final plea, leaving only silence, the kind of deep, unnatural quiet that makes your ears ring, as if the world had been sucked into a vacuum. Then, impossibly, everything returned to normal. The pews stood upright in perfect rows. The stained glass windows gleamed intact in their frames. The confessional sat closed and ordinary, showing no signs of the violence that had just unfolded. Only my racing heart and violently shaking hands proved that anything had happened at all. But I could still smell it, the lingering scent of old incense mixed with something rotting, something that had been dead far too long. I ran, stumbled through the ruins on legs that barely supported me, my shoes crunching against stone that shouldn't have existed. My hands shook so violently I could barely manage to get my keys into the car's ignition. I drove home in a daze, my mind unable to process what I'd witnessed. Sleep wouldn't come that night, or the night after. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those empty sockets staring at me with desperate hunger, heard the clinking of rosary chains like the sound of a soul in bondage. I returned to St. Agatha's the next morning, determined to find some rational explanation, some proof that I hadn't lost my mind in those cursed ruins. The fog had lifted, revealing the chapel in harsh daylight that should have made everything seem less threatening. But the confessional was gone. Not destroyed, not moved, not broken apart by vandals. simply absent as if it had never existed at all. I walked the entire perimeter of the ruined church 3 times, checking every corner, every shadow, every possible hiding place. There was no trace of the booth I'd seen the night before, no marks on the floor where it might have stood, no indentations in the dust. I should have felt relieved. I should have taken it as a blessing, proof that whatever had happened was some kind of stress-induced hallucination brought on by too many late nights and too much responsibility. But when I reached into my coat pocket that evening, my fingers brushed against something impossible. A rosary, not mine. The beads were old, cracked with age, their color faded from decades of handling. The cross was bent at an unnatural angle, twisted as if it had been subjected to tremendous force. And wrapped around the entire length was a single broken link of chain, still warm to the touch, as if it had just been torn from something larger. That was 20 years ago, but the story didn't end there. It never ends. Some nights, when sleep eludes me despite exhaustion, I hear it still. Whispers seeping through the walls of whatever rectory I'm assigned to, the scrape of fingernails against wood, the weight of something unseen pressing against my chest until I can barely breathe. The rosary sits in my desk drawer, and that broken chain link grows colder each year, as if whatever warmth it once held is slowly draining away. I've researched St. Agatha's history obsessively, diving into archives that most people never see. The records tell a different story than the official version. Father Michael Torres was excommunicated in 1951 for what the documents carefully term unholy practices involving coerced confessions. He died in that booth, they say, refusing last rites, denying the very salvation he'd spent his life offering to others. But here's what haunts me most. Every October 19th, I receive a confession slip in my mailbox. No postmark, no return address, no logical way it could have arrived, just my name written in fading ink, and below it, in handwriting that looks increasingly desperate, "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned." And the paper grows more yellow each year, more brittle, as if it's aging decades in the span of months. Last week, I found fresh claw marks on my bedroom door, 4 parallel gouges cut deep into the wood, exactly matching the marks I saw in that confessional 20 years ago. It's still trying to reach me, still seeking the absolution I was too terrified to complete. But what terrifies me even more is the possibility that I was wrong about everything that night. What if those chains weren't dragging Father Torres to hell? What if they were the only thing keeping something infinitely worse from getting out? What if my interrupted absolution didn't fail to free him, but instead began to free something else, something that had been using his desperate soul as a prison? The broken rosary grows heavier in my drawer each night. Sometimes I swear I can feel it moving, the chain link rotating slowly like a key turning in a lock. And in the quiet hours before dawn, when the world holds its breath between night and day, I hear it whispering, "Finish what you started." I've transferred parishes 7 times in 2 decades. Different states, different congregations, different hopes that distance might break whatever connection formed that night. But it follows. It always follows. Because some confessions once heard mark the listener forever. Some sins are too old, too deep, too twisted to ever be absolved by mortal man. And some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed again. The broken chain grows warmer as I write these words, as if responding to the telling, as if it knows that by sharing this story, I'm inviting you into the same darkness that's haunted me for 20 years. Have you felt it yet? That presence just beyond your peripheral vision? Because now that you know the story, now that you've heard his name and learned of his desperate hunger for absolution, you're part of it too. Welcome to the confession that never ends. Now get ready, let's start story 2. And if you're already scared, I feel sorry for you, because now you're going to die of fear. You hear about haunted houses and cursed objects all the time, but no one ever talks about haunted records, words so old and soaked in misery that even writing them down traps something within the ink itself. I never believed in that kind of supernatural contamination until I found the ledger of the dead buried in the basement archives of Boston College. It was June 1995, and I was knee-deep in a research project cataloging forgotten burial sites across Massachusetts. The work was tedious but necessary. Too many old cemeteries had been lost to development, their records scattered or destroyed. My job was to preserve what remained before it disappeared forever. St. Augustine's church had a particularly tragic history. A fire tore through the building in 1952, killing half the congregation during Sunday service. The newspapers called it an electrical fault, but the survivors whispered about something else, about the way the flames had moved, how they seemed to seek out specific people while leaving others untouched. The city shut down the church afterward, bulldozed the remains, and built a library over the consecrated ground. No one questioned it. People just wanted to forget, but the record survived, buried in the library's basement archives, among dusty hymnals and brittle pages that no one had touched in decades. That was my job, to catalog and preserve these forgotten documents before they crumbled to dust. The ledger of the dead was unlike anything else in the collection. Bound in thick, crumbling leather, its spine was half rotted with age, yet the binding held firm, as if something inside refused to let it fall apart. The cover bore no title, just deep scratches that might once have been symbols. When I opened it, the pages released a smell I'll never forget. Not just the mustiness of old paper, but something organic, something that had once been alive. The ink inside was strangely vivid despite the years, as if it had been written yesterday. Page after page contained meticulous lists of those buried on the original church grounds. Names, dates, causes of death, even notes from priests about final confessions. The handwriting was elegant, careful, the work of someone who took pride in preserving these final records. But one name had been different. One name had been violently scratched out, Brother Enoch, not neatly crossed out like a clerical error or administrative correction. No, this was frantic, desperate. Someone had hacked at the page with what looked like a blade, gouging deep furrows into the paper in their desperation to erase every trace of his existence. The violence of it was disturbing, as if whoever had done this was trying to scratch the name out of reality itself. That should have been my first warning. That night, I dreamed of him. A man in a dark monk's robe stood at the foot of my bed, hands folded in prayer. His gaunt face turned toward me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. His lips moved constantly in silent recitation, forming words I couldn't hear, but somehow felt in my bones. His eyes, pale, almost colorless, never left mine, as if he was waiting for something, expecting some kind of response. I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat despite the cool Boston night. My apartment felt different, charged with an energy that made the hair on my arms stand up. I tried to shake it off as stress, too many hours spent squinting at faded documents, too little sleep, too much coffee. But when I stumbled to my desk for a glass of water, I found my notebook still open to a fresh page. There, in the middle of what had been blank paper, someone had written a name in deep rust-colored ink that was still wet to the touch. Brother Enoch. The handwriting was mine. I stared at those two words, my breath coming in slow, uneven pulls. My hands trembled as I touched the ink. It was real, still damp, soaking slightly into the paper's fibers. No one else had been in my apartment. The doors were locked, the windows shut tight against the June heat. The only rational explanation was that I had written it myself in my sleep, but I knew that wasn't true. I had never sleepwalked before. I had no memory of getting up, of finding a pen, of forming those letters. And the ink, where had it come from? I checked every pen in my desk drawer, every marker in my apartment. None of them matched that deep rust-red color that looked almost like dried blood. The worst part was how right it felt to see his name there, as if it belonged on that page, as if my hand had simply been completing something that was always meant to be written. I tried to dismiss it, but the dream came again the next night, and the night after that. Each time, Brother Enoch stood a little closer, his silent prayer a little more urgent, his pale eyes a little more demanding. And each morning, I found his name written somewhere new. I threw myself into research, desperate to understand what was happening to me. The archives became my refuge and my torment. Every day brought new discoveries about Brother Enoch, and every night brought dreams that felt increasingly real. The basement of the library felt different now. Where before it had been simply quiet, now it felt watched. Every time I glanced up from the documents, something shifted in the corners of my vision, a flicker of movement where no one should be, a shadow that stretched too long or stood too still. The air grew heavier with each passing day, thick with a presence that made breathing feel like work. Then I found the letter. It was tucked behind a row of rotting hymnals, an envelope sealed with red wax that looked fresh despite the decades of dust surrounding it. No date, no signature, just a few frantic lines scrawled in handwriting that shook with terror. Do not speak his name. Do not write it. Do not look for him. Some names should remain forgotten. Ice crawled up my spine as I read those words. Someone else had encountered Brother Enoch, someone who had been frightened enough to hide this warning in the archives, where it might never be found. The paper felt cold under my fingers, and the red wax seal bore an impression I couldn't quite make out, symbols that hurt to look at directly. I snapped the ledger shut, shoved the letter into my bag, and bolted up the stairs, my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged bird. The sunlight above ground felt like salvation, washing away the oppressive weight that had been building in the basement. But even in the warmth of a June afternoon, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me up from the depths. The dream came again that night, but it was different. Brother Enoch stood closer than ever before, close enough that I could see the details of his face, the hollow cheeks, the thin lips that never stopped moving, the eyes that held intelligence and malice in equal measure. For the first time, I could hear his whispered prayer, though the words came out backwards, broken, as if the language itself was fighting against being spoken. Then his head snapped toward me with violent suddenness, and for the first time, he spoke aloud. "Bury it again, or the curse will rise anew." I woke with a sharp gasp, my lungs aching as if I had been suffocating in my sleep. My heart pounded so hard I could barely sit up, and when I looked at my nightstand, the notebook was there again, the name written darker, deeper in handwriting that was definitely mine, but somehow felt foreign. I should have walked away then. Should have burned the ledger, moved on, found some other research project in some other archive. But curiosity is a terrible thing, especially when it's mixed with the kind of academic obsession that had driven me to spend my life buried in forgotten documents. The next day I returned to the archives with more than just my usual research materials. I brought a shovel. The old church grounds were still partially accessible, just a stretch of fenced-off dirt behind the library where the original cemetery had once been. The records showed approximately where the graves had been located, but after 40 years and multiple construction projects, the exact boundaries were lost to time. I followed the guidance from my dreams, as insane as that sounds. Brother Enoch had been pointing in those silent moments before he spoke, his skeletal finger indicating a direction with absolute certainty. It led me to a patch of land near the back wall, where the earth felt different beneath my feet, softer, more recently disturbed, despite the decades that had passed. I began to dig as the sun set behind the library's bulk, casting long shadows across the forgotten cemetery. 6 feet down, my shovel hit something solid with a metallic clang that echoed strangely in the growing darkness. I dropped to my knees, brushing dirt away with my hands, my heart hammering with a mixture of excitement and dread. What I found changed everything. A skeletal hand emerged from the soil, still partially wrapped in rotting cloth that might once have been monks' robes. But it wasn't the bones that made my blood turn to ice. It was what the hand was clutching with desperate, eternal grip. A crucifix, but not like any I had ever seen. The metal was blackened as if by fire, its surface twisted and melted into shapes that hurt to look at directly. The figure of Christ had been carved away, replaced with symbols that seemed to writhe in the fading light. This wasn't a holy relic. It was its complete opposite, a perversion of everything sacred. The moment my fingers brushed against the cursed cross, the air around me shifted like reality, taking a deep breath before screaming. The world exhaled in relief the moment I touched that abomination, as if something that had been holding its breath for decades finally allowed itself to breathe. But what followed that relief was far worse than any tension. From the trees behind me came a voice, like dry leaves rustling in wind that shouldn't exist. "You shouldn't have done that." I spun around, my breath caught in my throat, dirt still clinging to my trembling hands. The trees stood motionless against the evening sky, not even a breeze to disturb their branches. But in the growing shadows near the library's bulk, I saw him, a figure in dark monk's robes, standing just beyond the reach of the security lights. Brother Enoch, waiting. He was exactly as he had appeared in my dreams, but seeing him in waking reality was completely different. There was a weight to his presence, a gravity that seemed to bend the very air around him. His pale eyes reflected light that wasn't there, and when his lips moved in that endless, silent prayer, I could feel the words pressing against my mind like cold fingers. I buried the cross again, my hands shaking as I threw dirt over that cursed thing as fast as I could move. I didn't care about archaeological protocol or proper documentation. I just wanted it covered, hidden, forgotten again. The soil felt heavier than it should have, as if it was fighting against accepting the relic back into its embrace. I ran, stumbled through the dark streets of Boston until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, never looking back, never slowing down, until I was behind the locked door of my apartment. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those pale orbs staring at me from shadows that seemed to move on their own. I never went back to the archives. I never finished my research project. I packed up my life and moved across the country, taking a teaching position at a small college in Oregon where no one had ever heard of Brother Enoch or St. Augustine's Church. But some curses don't respect geography. The dreams followed me to Oregon, and they were getting stronger. No longer was Brother Enoch content to stand silently at the foot of my bed. Now he spoke regularly, his voice a rasping whisper that seemed to come from inside my own skull. "Bury it again, bury it deeper, before others find it." And others were finding it. I started monitoring Boston news obsessively, watching for any mention of the library or construction on the old church grounds. 3 months after I'd fled, they broke ground for a new parking garage expansion. The workers found bones, lots of them. The project was halted while archaeologists were brought in to examine what everyone assumed was just an old, forgotten cemetery. But I knew better. I knew they would find the cursed cross eventually, and I knew what would happen when they did. The first archaeologist died of a heart attack while examining the relic. The second began speaking in languages that no one recognized, backwards Latin mixed with phrases that predated Christianity entirely. The third simply vanished one night, leaving behind only his clothes and the smell of sulfur. That's when I realized the truth about Brother Enoch and why his name had been so violently scratched from the ledger. He hadn't been just any monk. The deeper records, the ones locked away in church archives that most people never see, told a different story. He had been excommunicated in 1847 for what the documents carefully termed desecrating sacred relics and twisting them into instruments of dark worship. The Inquisition had tried him in secret, found evidence of practices that made even hardened church investigators sick with horror. They had executed him and buried him with his cursed collection, thinking that consecrated ground would contain his influence forever. They were wrong. The cross I had touched, I've researched its symbols obsessively, despite the nightmares they bring. It's a perversion of the crucifixion itself, designed to invert sacred power and channel it toward purposes that no human mind should contemplate. And now it knows I've touched it. Now it knows I've felt its power. Every anniversary of that night in the cemetery, I wake up with dirt under my fingernails despite washing my hands raw before bed. The notebook still appears on my desk, always open to that same page. The name growing bolder and more desperate each year, Brother Enoch, written in ink that matches the rust-red stains left by that unholy relic. But the worst part is the whisper that comes just before dawn, when the world is quiet and the barriers between realities are thinnest. Bury it again, and bring others. Because you see, by telling you this story, by speaking his name and describing what I found, I've done exactly what that hidden letter warned against. I've shared the contamination, and now you're part of it too. Now get ready. Let's start story 3. And if you're already scared, I feel sorry for you, because now you're going to die of fear. There's something unnatural about a bell ringing when there's no bell to ring. That simple impossibility is what drew me back to St. Helena's Parish Cemetery, night after night, even when every instinct screamed at me to stay away. I had just been transferred to Savannah, Georgia in November 2006, taking over a small but historic parish that dated back to the 1800s. The church itself was beautiful. Whitewashed walls, towering steeple, stained glass windows that caught the morning light like captured prayers. But the cemetery behind it stretched back into shadows and Spanish moss, filled with crumbling headstones and forgotten names. And the bell tower. God help me, that damned bell tower. It stood at the far edge of the cemetery, like a skeletal finger pointing toward heaven, its wooden frame weathered gray by decades of Georgia heat and humidity. No bell hung in its housing, hadn't for over 50 years, according to the parish records. The rope had rotted away long ago, the bronze bell itself sold to pay for roof repairs in 1954. So when the calls started coming from parishioners claiming they heard it tolling at exactly 3 a.m., I dismissed them as the imaginings of elderly minds and guilt-ridden consciences. Old Mrs. Pettigrew insisted it woke her every Tuesday night. Young Tommy Morrison swore it rang 13 times, one more than the traditional toll for the dead. I smiled, nodded, and made mental notes to check on their medications until I heard it myself. It was November 15th, a Tuesday night thick with fog that rolled off the Savannah River like the breath of something sleeping beneath the water. I was working late in the rectory, preparing my sermon for the following Sunday, when the sound cut through the humid air like a knife through silk. Deep, resonant, unmistakable. The bronze voice of a bell that didn't exist, tolling with the weight of centuries, shaking the very air around the cemetery with each impossible note. I sat frozen at my desk, pen still in hand, listening to something that couldn't be happening. 3 tolls, long and slow, each one seeming to come from deep underground rather than high above. I grabbed my flashlight and walked into the cemetery alone, my footsteps crunching on the shell and gravel path that wound between the headstones. The fog was thicker here, swirling around the monuments like ghostly fingers, exploring familiar territory. The beam of my light seemed swallowed by the mist, creating a small bubble of visibility that moved with me through the darkness. The bell tower loomed ahead, its empty frame stark against the cloudy night sky. As I approached, my light caught something that made my blood run cold. The wooden stairs leading up to the bell housing were wet, as if someone had just climbed them, leaving behind the moisture of night air on every step. But there were no footprints, no signs that anyone had been here except for that dampness that gleamed in my flashlight beam like tears on weathered wood. I climbed those stairs anyway, each step groaning beneath my weight, dust motes spiraling in the beam of my light like tiny spirits dancing in the air. The smell hit me halfway up. Not just mildew and old wood, but something organic, something that had been rotting for a very long time. At the top, I found exactly what I expected. Nothing. No bell, no rope, no mechanism that could have produced the sound I'd heard. Just empty space under a peaked roof, with gaps in the wooden slats that let in the fog and the faint light of a cloud-covered moon. But as I turned to leave, my light caught something that shouldn't have been there. Beneath the tower, barely visible through the gaps in the flooring, was a tombstone, small, almost hidden beneath decades of overgrown ivy that had claimed this corner of the cemetery. I climbed down and pushed through the vegetation, my hands coming away, sticky with moisture that smelled faintly of copper. The name carved into the weathered stone was barely legible, but I traced the letters with my fingertips. Bishop Alexander Cortez, excommunicated 1887. The word excommunicated had been carved deeper than the rest, as if whoever made the stone wanted to ensure that particular detail would outlast everything else. Beneath it, in smaller letters almost worn away by time and weather, were the words, "Denied sacred ground, denied sacred rest." A chill spread through me that had nothing to do with the November air. I had read about Bishop Cortez in my seminary studies, a priest accused of heresy in the late 1800s. Stripped of his holy orders for practices the church refused to document officially. He had died in disgrace, his funeral rites denied, his body buried outside of consecrated ground. Beneath my feet, the earth around his grave was shifting. The ground moved in slow, deliberate shifts, like something was pushing upward from below with methodical patience. Not the quick scurrying of an animal or the settling of old earth. This was purposeful, rhythmic, as if something buried was trying to claw its way back to the surface, one handful of dirt at a time. My breath caught in my throat as I took an instinctive step backward, my mind fighting desperately for rational explanation. Settling ground, I told myself. A trick of the moonlight filtering through fog, the shifting shadows created by Spanish moss swaying in wind I couldn't feel. But there was no wind. The air hung still and thick, heavy with the promise of rain that wouldn't come. And the movement beneath Bishop Cortez's grave continued, gaining strength and purpose with each passing moment. Then the bell tolled again, except this time it didn't come from above me. The deep bronze voice rose from the ground itself, from the grave, from the earth, from somewhere far beneath the cemetery where no bell should exist. 3 tolls, each one vibrating through the soles of my feet and up into my bones, rattling my teeth and making my vision blur at the edges. My flashlight flickered, the beam becoming weak and yellow as if the batteries were suddenly draining. The temperature around me dropped so fast that my breath began forming visible clouds, despite the fact that Savannah in November should have been mild and humid. That's when I saw him. A shadow rose from the disturbed grave like smoke given form, coalescing into the outline of a man draped in tattered episcopal robes. His shape wavered and shifted, half real and half something else, like heat rising from summer pavement, but made of darkness instead of distortion. Bishop Alexander Cortez, excommunicated, denied sacred ground, denied sacred rest. When he spoke, his voice was the sound of wind through a graveyard at midnight, low and hollow and carrying the weight of more than a century of rage. I was silenced. Will you hear me now? I should have run. Every survival instinct I possessed screamed at me to turn and flee, to get as far away from this desecrated ground as my legs could carry me. But something about his words, about the desperate hunger in his voice, held me frozen in place like a deer caught in headlights. The bell tolled once more, and this time the grave at his feet split open with a sound like breaking bones. The earth cracked and crumbled, revealing the dark interior of a burial site that should have remained sealed forever. Inside, something pale gleamed in the weak moonlight that managed to penetrate the fog. I stepped closer, my pulse pounding in my ears like a drum made of terror and morbid fascination. The beam of my dying flashlight illuminated what lay within the broken grave, and my stomach lurched with sick understanding. The bones were wrong, twisted, and broken in ways that no natural death could cause, arranged in patterns that spoke of violence and deliberate desecration. The skull was cracked down the middle, the jaw hanging open in an eternal scream. But what made me want to vomit was what I found wrapped in rotting cloth between the ribs of the skeletal remains. A tongue, dried, blackened, preserved by time and hatred, wrapped carefully in cloth that had once been white, but was now stained the color of old blood. Someone had cut it from his mouth, ripped it from his throat, and stuffed it inside his corpse before sealing him in unhallowed ground. They had literally silenced him, even in death. A violent chill ripped through my spine as the full horror of what I was seeing crashed over me. Bishop Cortez hadn't just been excommunicated, he had been brutalized, mutilated, his very voice stolen from him and buried with his broken body. No wonder he couldn't rest. No wonder his spirit lingered in this place, seeking someone who would listen to words he could no longer speak. The air around me crackled with energy that made the hair on my arms stand up. The bishop's spectral form twisted and writhed, his empty eye sockets locked onto mine with an intensity that burned like ice. When he spoke again, his voice came not from where his mouth should be, but from everywhere at once. From the ground, from the fog, from the very air itself. I was silenced, he repeated, each word carrying the weight of decades of frustrated rage. But you will listen. The final toll rang inside my head rather than my ears, a bronze voice that seemed to explode directly into my brain. My vision split, fractures of light shooting across my sight like breaking glass. My skull felt like it was going to crack open under the pressure, and the world tilted sideways as if reality itself was losing its balance. The last thing I remember before the darkness took me was the feeling of something cold and ancient flowing into my throat, filling my mouth with the taste of copper and earth, and words that had been waiting more than a century to be spoken. I woke up at dawn, lying next to the open grave, my body aching like I had been beaten with clubs, my throat burning as if I had been screaming for hours. The early morning sun filtered through the Spanish moss in golden shafts that should have been beautiful but felt like accusations, illuminating the scene of my encounter with harsh clarity. The grave was sealed shut again, not filled in, sealed, as if the earth had simply closed over the opening like water returning to its natural state. The headstone showed no signs of the disturbance I had witnessed, no cracks in the stone, no evidence that anything had split the ground open just hours before. Even the ivy had grown back, covering the marker as if decades had passed instead of a single night. But the name on the tombstone was gone. Where Bishop Alexander Cortez had been carved deep into the weathered stone, there was now only smooth granite, worn clean by time and weather. It was as if he had never existed at all, as if the entire encounter had been nothing more than a fever dream brought on by too much responsibility and too little sleep. Except for one thing, when I tried to speak, my voice wasn't my own. The words that came from my throat were deeper, older, carrying an accent that belonged to another century and a rage that wasn't mine. When I attempted to say my morning prayers, what emerged was Latin, spoken in a dialect that predated Vatican II, mixed with phrases I didn't recognize but somehow understood. Condemnations of the church hierarchy, accusations of corruption and betrayal that burned my tongue as I spoke them. I left St. Helena's 3 days later, claiming a family emergency that required my immediate transfer. The diocese was understanding, too understanding, as if they had been expecting this request, as if they knew something about that cemetery, about that empty bell tower, about the bishop who had been erased from both earth and record. But leaving Savannah didn't solve my problem. It only made it worse. The voice in my throat grew stronger with each passing day. During Mass, I would begin the familiar litany only to have different words emerge, angry words, bitter accusations against the very institution I had devoted my life to serving. My parishioners noticed the change. The way my sermons began to veer into territory that made them uncomfortable, topics that questioned the authority of Rome and the purity of church doctrine. I tried to fight it, tried to maintain control over my own voice, but Bishop Cortez was stronger than I was. He had spent over a century building his fury, storing up every word he had been denied the right to speak. And now he had found a vessel, someone who had heard his story, someone who had witnessed his grave, someone whose throat could carry the message he had been silenced from delivering. The research I conducted in my desperate search for answers only made things worse. The deeper I dug into Bishop Cortez's history, the more I understood why the church had been so desperate to silence him. His accusations weren't the ravings of a madman. They were specific, detailed, backed by evidence that powerful men had thought buried forever. Financial corruption, sexual misconduct, political manipulation that reached into the highest levels of church hierarchy. Bishop Cortez hadn't been excommunicated for heresy. He had been eliminated because he had threatened to expose truths that would have shaken the foundations of the institution itself. And now those accusations poured from my throat during every sermon, every confession, every private conversation. I couldn't stop them. The words came whether I wanted them to or not, carrying the weight of authentic documentation and insider knowledge that I had never possessed. The church moved quickly to contain the damage. I was quietly reassigned to increasingly remote parishes, placed in positions where my concerning theological positions would have minimal impact. When that wasn't enough, I was encouraged to take a leave of absence for spiritual renewal and reflection. But even now, 10 years later, Bishop Cortez hasn't finished speaking through me. Every time I hear a bell toll, any bell anywhere, I feel him stirring in my throat, gathering strength for another burst of accusations that burn like acid as they leave my lips. I've learned to live with it, this contamination of voice and spirit. I've learned to warn people before I speak, to apologize in advance for words that aren't entirely my own. Some days I can maintain control for hours at a time. Other days, his voice dominates completely, and I become nothing more than a vessel for a dead man's rage. But here's what terrifies me most. Sometimes, when he speaks through me, people listen, really listen. And when they do, I see the same hunger for truth in their eyes that must have driven Bishop Cortez to risk everything more than a century ago. Because what if he wasn't the heretic? What if he was just the only one brave enough to speak the truth? And what if, by telling you this story, I've just passed his voice on to you? If these testimonies are making you question what lies beyond death's veil, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because what you've heard so far is just the beginning. The next 6 stories will test the very limits of your faith. Now get ready. Let's start story 4. And if you're already scared, I feel sorry for you because now you're going to die of fear. I never should have followed the candles. That's what I tell myself every October 30th when they appear again, flickering just outside my window like accusatory fingers pointing at sins I haven't committed yet. Because once you've seen them, once you've walked among them, they never really leave you alone. It was October 2011, and I was working on a story for the New Orleans Times-Picayune about strange disappearances linked to the old Saint-Germain cemetery. 5 people had vanished over the past 3 years, all on Halloween night, all last seen near the cemetery gates. The police had no leads, no evidence, no rational explanation for how someone could simply disappear from a locked cemetery in the middle of a city. I thought it was just another urban legend, the kind of story that newspapers love to run during Halloween week to boost circulation. New Orleans was full of ghost tours and voodoo shops that thrived on exactly this kind of supernatural tourism. But the families of the missing were real. Their grief was real. And their insistence that something unnatural was happening in Saint-Germain deserved investigation. The cemetery was old, dating back to the 1840s. Its above-ground tombs, typical of New Orleans burial practices, necessitated by the high water table. but even locals avoided it after dark, crossing themselves as they hurried past its wrought iron gates. The stories they told were consistent enough to be disturbing. A ghostly funeral procession that appeared on certain nights, a line of hooded figures carrying candles through the cemetery's narrow paths. Some said they were lost souls, condemned to repeat their funeral march for eternity. Others claimed they were spirits reenacting an unfinished ritual, something that had been interrupted by death and could never be completed. I thought it was atmospheric nonsense, the kind of tale that grew in the telling until fiction became accepted fact. So, on October 30th, I took my camera, my notebook, and made the worst mistake of my life. I went alone. The cemetery was silent when I arrived just before midnight, the air thick with humidity that pressed against my skin like damp cloth. The mausoleums loomed in the darkness, their stone facades cracked and weathered by decades of Louisiana heat and hurricane seasons. The scent of old earth and decaying flowers clung to the air, mixed with something else, something that reminded me of burnt wax and old paper. I positioned myself near the main gate, camera ready, notebook prepared to document whatever atmospheric phenomenon was responsible for the local legends. I expected to find nothing more than shadows playing tricks on grieving minds. Maybe some teenagers with candles perpetuating the myth for their own amusement. At exactly 12:03 a.m., I saw the first flicker of candlelight. A line of figures emerged from behind the larger tombs, moving with a grace that seemed to defy the uneven ground beneath their feet. They wore heavy black veils that obscured their faces completely, and each carried a single white candle that burned with flames too steady for the humid night air. Their movements were unnaturally synchronized, as if they were all following the same unheard rhythm, all responding to the same silent conductor. I should have stayed hidden, should have observed from a distance, taken my photographs, and written my story about local folklore and the power of suggestion. But something about the procession called to me, drew me forward with a compulsion I couldn't resist. As I stepped closer, raising my camera for a better shot, the figure at the front of the procession stopped walking. Slowly, deliberately, she turned toward me, and though I couldn't see her face through the heavy veil, I felt her gaze lock onto mine with the intensity of a physical touch. Then she smiled. I couldn't see it, but I knew it was there. Could feel it in the way the air around me suddenly grew colder, in the way my hands began to shake without any conscious reason. "You're late, child," she whispered, her voice carrying across the space between us, despite being barely audible. And then she raised her hand, and in her grasp, where a funeral wreath should have been, was a folded piece of paper that gleamed white in the candlelight. My obituary. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. Couldn't process what I was seeing as she unfolded the paper with deliberate care, holding it up so that the candlelight illuminated the words printed there in bold funeral home typography. My name, my birth date, and a death date of October 31st, 2011, tomorrow. The paper looked old, yellowed at the edges, as if it had been prepared years ago and stored somewhere dark and dry, waiting for this moment. The ink was faded but legible, and at the bottom, in elegant script, were the words, "Beloved by none, mourned by few, forgotten by all." My legs wanted to run, but they refused to obey. I stood frozen in place like a deer caught in headlights, staring at the impossible document that bore my name and tomorrow's date in neat funeral home typography. The paper was real. I could see the texture of it, the way the candlelight played across its yellowed surface, the careful fold lines that spoke of being handled and stored for years. But this was impossible. Obituaries weren't written in advance, weren't prepared and carried through cemeteries by ghostly processions. There had to be a rational explanation, a prank, an elaborate hoax, some kind of psychological manipulation designed to play on local fears and superstitions. "No," I choked out, shaking my head violently. "This isn't real. This can't be real." The old woman at the front of the procession tilted her head, and though I still couldn't see her face through the heavy veil, I could feel her amusement like cold fingers tracing down my spine. Behind her, the rest of the figures stood motionless, their candles burning with flames that never flickered, never wavered, never responded to the humid night air that should have made them dance. "Reality is a matter of perspective, child," she said, her voice carrying that same whispered quality that somehow reached my ears despite the distance between us. "And your perspective is about to change dramatically." She held the obituary higher, angling it so that more candlelight fell across its surface. I could see more details now, the name of the funeral home, the time and location of services that would apparently be held tomorrow evening, even a brief biographical paragraph that mentioned my work at the newspaper and my tragic death while investigating local folklore. How could they know about my investigation? How could they have known I would be here tonight, in this cemetery, at this exact time? The logical part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Surveillance, inside information, elaborate preparation by someone who wanted to scare me away from the story. But looking at that paper, feeling the weight of destiny pressing down on me like a physical force, I knew this wasn't some human prank. This was something else entirely, something that operated by rules I didn't understand and couldn't hope to fight. My first instinct was to run, to bolt out of that cemetery and never look back. But when I tried to take a step backward, my feet wouldn't move. The ground beneath me felt different suddenly, not solid earth and gravel, but something soft and yielding, like standing on a grave that was slowly opening beneath my weight. The old woman seemed to sense my growing panic, and her head tilted further, like a curious bird examining an interesting specimen. "You shouldn't have come, child. But since you're here..." She gestured to the figures behind her, and they began to raise their candles in perfect unison, creating a circle of light that trapped me in its center. The air thickened, pressing against my lungs and making each breath feel like work. The temperature dropped so suddenly that my breath began forming visible clouds, despite the fact that October in New Orleans should have been warm and humid. The candle flames stretched upward unnaturally, growing longer and brighter until they cast dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. "What do you want?" I managed to whisper, my voice barely audible even to myself. "Want?" The old woman laughed, a sound like dry leaves rustling in a wind that I couldn't feel. "We don't want anything, child. We're simply collecting what's already ours." The procession began to move again, but this time they were walking toward me, their synchronized steps creating a rhythm that seemed to match the panicked beating of my heart. As they drew closer, I could see more details that my mind tried desperately to reject. The way their feet didn't quite touch the ground, the way their veils moved without any breeze to disturb them, the way their candles cast light that seemed to bend and twist in ways that defied physics. And then I noticed something that made my blood turn to ice. Each of the figures was carrying something else along with their candles. Not funeral wreaths or flowers or any of the traditional burial offerings I might have expected. They were carrying photographs. Old, faded photographs of people I didn't recognize, men and women in clothing from different eras, their faces captured in the formal poses typical of old portrait photography. But as the procession drew closer, I began to make out details in those photographs that shouldn't have been possible. Each picture showed its subject lying in a coffin, eyes closed, hands folded over their chest in the peaceful repose of death. These weren't wedding photos or graduation pictures or any of the usual memorial images you might expect at a funeral. These were post-mortem photographs, and every single one was dated October 31st of different years, going back over a century. The truth hit me like a physical blow to the chest. This wasn't just a random ghostly procession or some supernatural curiosity for ghost tours to exploit. This was a harvest. An annual collection that had been going on for more than 100 years, claiming one victim every Halloween night, adding their photograph to the growing collection carried by figures who had once been human themselves. "You're starting to understand," the old woman said, and I could hear the satisfaction in her voice. "Good. It makes the transition so much easier when there's no denial to overcome." I tried to run then, truly tried, but my legs felt like they were moving through thick mud. Each step required enormous effort, and I could only manage the slowest of movements while the procession continued to close the distance between us with their gliding, synchronized approach. "Please," I begged, though I wasn't sure what I was asking for. Mercy? Understanding? A rational explanation that would make this nightmare dissolve into some kind of elaborate hoax? Begging is pointless, child. The contract was written long before you were born, signed in blood, and witnessed by powers far older than this city. She paused directly in front of me, close enough that I could smell something like old roses and embalming fluid emanating from beneath her veil. "Every Halloween, one comes to us willingly, one drawn by curiosity, by the desire to document and understand, just like you." The other figures had formed a complete circle around me now, their candles creating a barrier of light that somehow felt more like prison bars than illumination. In their photographs, I could see the faces of my predecessors. Journalists, paranormal investigators, curious locals, all of whom had made the same mistake I had made. All of whom had thought they were researching a story instead of walking into a trap that had been set before they were born. "The missing people," I whispered, understanding flooding through me like ice water in my veins. "The disappearances. They didn't vanish randomly. You took them." "We took only what was offered," the old woman corrected. "Each came seeking something. Truth, evidence, understanding. We simply provided exactly what they were looking for." See, she reached into the folds of her dark robes and withdrew something that made my heart stop. A camera. Old, antique, the kind used for post-mortem photography in the late 1800s when such pictures were common ways to memorialize the dead. "Your contribution to our collection will be particularly valuable," she continued, adjusting settings on the camera with hands that moved too precisely, too deliberately, like a photographer who had been practicing the same shot for decades. A journalist investigating the very phenomenon she's about to join. There's a poetry to it that we appreciate. The circle of candles began to move, rotating slowly around me like a carousel of the damned. With each revolution, the flames grew brighter and the air grew colder, until I could see my breath forming clouds that caught the light and dispersed like tiny spirits seeking escape. I felt my phone buzz in my pocket, a text message that somehow got through despite being in the middle of a supernatural hurricane. With trembling fingers, I managed to extract it and read the screen. "See you next year." No sender, no phone number. Just those 4 words that made my blood freeze solid in my veins, because I understood then that this wasn't just about Halloween night. This wasn't just about one annual harvest that would claim me and be done. The text was a promise or a threat that this connection, once formed, would never truly end. The old woman raised her camera, the lens catching candlelight and reflecting it back like a malevolent eye. "Hold still, child. This will only take a moment, and then you'll understand everything." That's when I ran. Somehow, impossibly, I broke free from whatever force had been holding me in place and sprinted toward the cemetery gates with speed born of pure terror. Behind me, I could hear laughter, not just from the old woman, but from all of them, a chorus of amusement that followed me through the narrow paths between the mausoleums. I reached my car and drove home in a daze, my hands shaking so violently I could barely grip the steering wheel. I spent the rest of the night awake, staring at the clock, waiting for October 31st to begin and wondering if my death date was truly written in stone or if running had somehow changed my fate. At 12:01 a.m. on Halloween, my phone buzzed again. "See you next year." That was 12 years ago. Every October 30th at exactly 12:03 a.m., I see them again, flickering candlelight just outside my window, the silhouette of the old woman standing motionless in my yard. And every Halloween, the text arrives right on schedule. They're patient, they're certain, and every year I feel my will to resist growing weaker. Because sometimes, in the darkest hours before dawn, I catch myself wondering what it would be like to stop running and finally join their eternal procession through the cemetery, where time has no meaning and death is just the beginning of a much longer story. Now get ready, let's start story 5, and if you're already scared, I feel sorry for you, because now you're going to die of fear. I never thought much about cemetery work when I started. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. Dig the graves, fill the graves, keep the headstones clean, maintain the grounds. Simple, honest labor that let me work mostly alone in peaceful surroundings. But there was one rule I was given on my first day at Oak Hill Cemetery in Evansville, Indiana, and I should have paid more attention to the fear in the old caretaker's eyes when he told me. Never open the mausoleum at the edge of the woods, Mr. Grayson said, his weathered hands gripping my shoulder with surprising strength. That door's been sealed for a reason, and it needs to stay that way. I laughed when he said it, thinking he was just trying to spook the new guy. Every job had its hazing rituals, its inside jokes designed to keep newcomers on their toes, but Mr. Grayson didn't crack a smile. He just shook his head slowly, his eyes distant with something that looked like old trauma. I'm serious, son. That door opens, people die. It's been that way for 40 years, and I pray to God it stays sealed for 40 more. That was in 1983, back when I was young enough to think I knew everything and old enough to think I was immune to superstition. The first few months were exactly what I expected. Early mornings, quiet evenings, the occasional funeral that required me to work around grieving families. Oak Hill was a beautiful cemetery, its rolling hills dotted with mature oak trees that gave it its name, its paths lined with well-maintained headstones dating back to the Civil War. But every once in a while, I'd notice something that bothered me. The mausoleum door would be slightly ajar, not wide open, not obviously disturbed, just a crack, like someone had tried to step out but changed their mind at the last moment. The first time I saw it, I assumed it was just settling stone or maybe an animal that had somehow gotten inside and pushed against the door. I walked over and pulled it shut, making sure the heavy iron latch clicked into place with satisfying finality. The next morning, it was open again. Just that same narrow gap, as if something inside was testing the boundaries of its prison, checking to see if today might be the day it could finally emerge. I started making it part of my daily routine. Check the mausoleum door, close it if necessary, move on with my work. It seemed harmless enough, just one of those maintenance issues that old buildings develop over time. But then came the whispers, soft, faint sounds that I first dismissed as wind moving through the oak trees, or maybe the settling of old stone. But wind doesn't call your name, and settling stone doesn't sob like a heartbroken child. The sounds came only at night, only when I was alone on the grounds doing evening maintenance, and always from the direction of that mausoleum. It wasn't the wind, it was words, spoken in a voice too young and too desperate to belong to anything living. You left me. The first time I heard it clearly, I dropped my rake and spun around, searching the growing darkness for some sign of who was speaking. The cemetery was empty. The iron gates locked for the night, no way for anyone to have gotten inside without me knowing. But the voice came again, carried on air that suddenly felt too cold for a mild Indiana evening. You left me alone. I should have called the police, should have reported trespassers or vandalism or whatever rational explanation my mind could grasp for what I was hearing. Instead, I found myself walking toward the mausoleum, my footsteps crunching on fallen leaves, my heart beating just a little too fast. The door was open wider than I'd ever seen it before. Not just a crack now, but a gap wide enough for a person to slip through if they turned sideways. The interior was dark, impenetrable shadow that seemed to swallow the beam of my flashlight like a hungry mouth. But I could hear something inside, a soft, muffled sobbing that seemed to come from very far away, as if the mausoleum was much deeper than its exterior dimensions suggested. Every instinct I had told me to close the door, to latch it tight, to walk away, and never come back after dark. But there was something about that crying, something so genuinely heartbroken and desperate, that I couldn't just ignore it. One night, I finally broke the rule. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The mausoleum was smaller than it appeared from outside, just a simple stone chamber with walls lined in marble plaques marking various burial niches. But in the center of the floor was a single child's coffin, its lid slightly askew as if it had been opened from within. The coffin was empty. The empty coffin should have been my first warning to run. But instead I found myself drawn deeper into the mausoleum's shadows, my flashlight beam revealing details that made my stomach twist with growing unease. The stone chamber was cold, not just cool like underground spaces naturally are, but ice cold, as if winter had taken permanent residence in this one small room. Then I heard it again, that soft, muffled sobbing that had drawn me here in the first place. But now I could tell it wasn't coming from inside the mausoleum at all. It was right behind me, close enough that I should have felt breath on my neck. I spun around, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, and for a split second I saw nothing but empty space. Then the beam caught something that made my blood turn to ice. A shadow against the back wall, small and hunched, rocking back and forth with the rhythmic motion of inconsolable grief. The shadow of a child. "You left me," came the whisper again, and this time I could see the shadow's mouth moving, could watch its small form shudder with each sob. "You were supposed to stay." I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the empty coffin, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "I don't understand," I managed to choke out. "What do you mean?" The shadow stopped rocking and turned toward me, and though it had no features I could make out, I felt its attention like a weight pressing against my chest. When it spoke again, its voice carried a sadness so profound that it made my eyes water involuntarily. "You buried me, but you didn't stay. You left me alone in the dark." Buried? I had never buried a child, had never been involved in any funeral that... Then I noticed the shovel. It was leaning against the back wall of the mausoleum, an old, rust-stained thing with a wooden handle worn smooth by decades of use. But what made my stomach drop wasn't its presence. It was the engraving carved into the wooden handle, worn but still legible after all these years. My initials, my name. I stepped closer, my hands shaking as I reached out to touch the tool that somehow bore my identity, despite being something I had never seen before. The wood felt familiar under my fingers, worn in exactly the places where my hands would grip it, shaped by years of use that I had no memory of. "That's not possible," I whispered. But even as I said it, I knew I was lying to myself. The shovel was mine, had always been mine, just like the child's voice that spoke of burial and abandonment was telling me a truth I couldn't accept. The shadow moved closer, and now I could see more details in its form. A small figure in what looked like a burial dress, its arms reaching toward me with desperate longing. "You used to visit every day," it said. "You used to bring flowers and talk to me. Why did you stop?" Images flashed through my mind like half-remembered dreams. A small grave under the oak trees, fresh flowers placed beside a tiny headstone, hours spent sitting in the grass talking to someone who couldn't answer back. But these weren't my memories. They couldn't be. I had no history with this cemetery before 1983, no connection to any child buried here. "I don't remember," I said, and the words felt like a confession of some terrible sin. "You promised you'd never leave me alone." The shadow was close enough now that I could feel coldness radiating from it like winter air. "You promised you'd always take care of me." The empty coffin at my feet creaked, and when I looked down, I saw something that made my vision blur at the edges. Inside the satin-lined interior was an indentation, not the shape of a small body, but the outline of someone kneeling, as if a person had spent long hours crouched beside this grave, tending to it, caring for it. The shape matched my knees perfectly. "Who are you?" I whispered, though part of me already knew the answer would destroy whatever remained of my sanity. The shadow reached out and touched my hand, and the moment its fingers made contact with my skin, the memories flooded back like a dam bursting. Not my memories. Someone else's. Someone who had worked this cemetery decades before I was born. Someone who had made a promise to a dying child and broken it in the worst possible way. I saw myself, but not myself. Someone who looked exactly like me, but lived 40 years earlier, digging a small grave under an oak tree, tears streaming down my face as I lowered a tiny coffin into the earth. I saw myself visiting that grave every day for months, talking to the empty air, leaving flowers that wilted and were replaced with fresh ones. And then I saw myself stopping, forgetting, moving away and leaving a child spirit to wait alone in the dark for a caretaker who would never return. The memories weren't mine, but they felt more real than anything I had ever experienced. I watched myself, or the man who wore my face 40 years before my birth, make a promise to a dying child that he would never be forgotten, never be left alone. I felt the weight of that oath, like a physical chain around my chest, binding me to a commitment I had no memory of making. "Samuel," I whispered, and somehow I knew that was the child's name, knew it with the certainty of someone who had spoken it aloud every day for months before forgetting it completely. "Your name is Samuel." The shadow stopped moving, its form becoming more solid, more real. "You remember," it said, and for the first time since I'd entered the mausoleum, there was something other than sadness in its voice. Relief, maybe, or hope. But the memories kept coming, showing me things I didn't want to see, revealing truths that made my hands shake with more than just cold. The man who looked like me hadn't just been a caretaker. He had been the child's father. Samuel had died of consumption in 1943, buried here in Oak Hill Cemetery because it was the only place his father could afford. And the father had made a promise that death wouldn't separate them, that he would tend the grave every day until his own death brought them together again. But promises are easier to make than keep, especially when grief fades and life demands attention for the living. The visits became less frequent, the flowers went unreplaced, the conversations stopped, and eventually the father moved away, leaving behind a grave that was forgotten by everyone except the small spirit trapped within it. "But that's not me," I said aloud, trying to deny the obvious truth that was staring me in the face. That was someone else, someone who just happened to look like me. Samuel's shadow tilted its head with the patient gesture of a child who knows adults often need time to understand simple truths. "Time is different for us," he said. "Past and future, they're just words. What matters is the promise." The shovel in my hands felt heavier suddenly, its weight pulling me toward the empty coffin with inexorable force. And as I looked at that small, silk-lined box, I finally understood what Samuel needed from me, what he had been waiting 40 years for someone to understand. The coffin wasn't meant to hold a body, it was meant to hold a promise. With hands that moved of their own accord, I knelt beside the small casket and placed the shovel inside, its worn handle fitting perfectly into the indentation that had been waiting for its return. The moment the tool touched the silk lining, the temperature in the mausoleum rose, and Samuel's shadow became more substantial, more real. "Thank you," he whispered, and his voice was fading already, growing distant as if he was traveling to some place I couldn't follow. "Thank you for keeping your promise." But even as his spirit found peace, I felt something else beginning, a weight settling onto my shoulders like an invisible yoke. A responsibility that extended far beyond one forgotten child's grave. The mausoleum held more than just Samuel's empty coffin, I realized. It held the promises of every caretaker who had ever worked these grounds, every oath made to the dead that had been broken by the living. And now those promises were mine to keep. I left the mausoleum that night, but I never really left at all. In the 40 years since, I've tended this cemetery with the devotion of someone who understands that death doesn't end relationships, it just changes them. I visit every grave at least once a week, leaving flowers for those who have no living relatives, talking to headstones that carry names no one else remembers. Because I learned something in that mausoleum that most people never understand. The dead don't want much from the living. They don't need elaborate monuments or expensive flowers or lengthy mourning periods. They just want to be remembered. They just want someone to acknowledge that they existed, that their lives mattered, that their deaths left holes in the world that still need tending. Some nights, when I'm doing evening maintenance, I still hear whispers from various graves, not demands or threats, but simple requests. A flower for a forgotten anniversary. A moment of silence for a birthday that no one else remembers. A quiet word acknowledging that someone is still listening. The mausoleum door stays closed now, its purpose fulfilled. But sometimes I catch glimpses of Samuel playing among the oak trees, no longer trapped by unfinished promises, but free to enjoy the eternal childhood that death granted him. He waves sometimes and I wave back. Two old friends sharing a secret that bridges the gap between life and whatever comes after. But here's what haunts me. Every new caretaker who comes to work at Oak Hill receives the same warning I did about never opening the mausoleum door. And every time I give that warning, I see something in their eyes that terrifies me. A familiarity they can't explain, a recognition of a responsibility they don't yet understand. Because the man who looked like me 40 years ago wasn't my father or my grandfather or any blood relative I could trace. He was just someone who shared my face, my hands, my capacity for promises that outlast the people who make them. And somewhere, in another cemetery in another city, there's probably a man who looks exactly like you, making the same kinds of oaths to the dead that you'll be called upon to honor someday. The cycle never ends. The promises accumulate, and eventually, everyone gets their turn to dig. Last week, I hired a new assistant, a young man fresh out of college who needs the work and doesn't mind the solitude. He has kind eyes and gentle hands, the sort of person who would naturally talk to graves as if they could hear him. He looks exactly like me at that age, exactly like the man in my inherited memories. And when I gave him the same warning about the mausoleum that Mr. Grayson gave me 40 years ago, I saw that familiar flash of recognition in his eyes. Time is different for the dead, Samuel once told me. Past and future are just words. I'm beginning to understand what he meant. Now get ready, let's start story 6, and if you're already scared, I feel sorry for you because now you're going to die of fear. I never believed in curses, not really, not until I saw the painting cry tears of blood and heard it beg for prayers that had been interrupted by death itself. The portrait arrived at St. Catherine's Church in Pittsburgh on a grey October morning in 1997, donated by an estate sale that carried no documentation and fewer answers. I had taken a temporary position assisting with the church's restoration project, cataloguing artifacts and religious items that had accumulated in storage over decades of forgotten donations. Most of it was typical church detritus, old hymnals with water damage, communion sets missing pieces, statuary that had seen better centuries. Nothing that prepared me for what I found wrapped in a moth-eaten cloth in the deepest corner of the rectory basement. The moment I pulled away that aged covering, I felt watched, not the gentle observation of a well-crafted portrait, but something more invasive, more personal, as if the painted eyes were studying me with the intensity of someone trying to memorize my face for future reference. The painting depicted a nobleman from what appeared to be the late 18th century, tall and sharp-featured with piercing dark eyes that seemed to follow movement, even when you weren't looking directly at them. His hands were folded in prayer, a golden crucifix hanging from fingers that had been painted with unsettling realism. Every detail was unnaturally precise. The texture of his velvet coat, the individual hairs of his beard, the way light caught the surface of his eyes, as if they were wet with unshed tears. Beneath the ornate frame, a small brass plaque bore the only identification: Lord William Gauthier, 1789-1824. No other records existed in the church archives, no donation logs, no historical mentions, no explanation for how this obviously expensive portrait had ended up forgotten in a basement storage room. It was as if someone had deliberately tried to erase all trace of its provenance. The first sign that something was wrong came that very night. I was working late in the rectory office, finishing the day's cataloguing, when I heard it. Soft weeping coming from somewhere deeper in the building. At first I assumed it was one of the elderly parishioners who sometimes came to pray in the evening hours, someone dealing with grief or loss who needed the comfort of empty pews and flickering votive candles. But when I went to check, the church was empty. The crying continued, muffled and distant, seeming to come from the basement where I'd been working earlier. Following the sound down the narrow stairs, I traced it to the storage room where Lord William Gauthier's portrait sat propped against a wall. And that's when I saw them, teardrops on the painting's surface. Not condensation from the basement's humidity, not water damage from a leaking pipe, actual tears streaming down the nobleman's painted cheeks in glistening tracks that caught the overhead light like liquid silver. I reached out with trembling fingers to touch one of the drops, and it was warm, body temperature, real. The weeping stopped the moment my skin made contact with the painted surface, but the moisture on my fingertips was undeniable proof that what I had witnessed was impossible, yet absolutely real. I wiped the tears away with my sleeve, telling myself there had to be some rational explanation. Chemical reactions in old paint, atmospheric pressure causing oils to weep, anything but the obvious truth my mind refused to accept. But the next morning, the tears were back. Fresh streams running from Lord William's dark eyes, pooling slightly on the lower frame before dripping onto the basement floor. The carpet beneath the portrait was damp with moisture that had no earthly source, and when I knelt to examine it more closely, I noticed something that made my stomach lurch with sudden understanding. The nobleman's expression had changed. Subtly, almost imperceptibly, but definitely different from the day before. Where his painted mouth had been set in a firm line of aristocratic composure, there was now a slight downturn that suggested sorrow. His eyes, which had initially gazed straight ahead with confident authority, now seemed to look slightly upward, as if seeking divine intervention from a heaven that remained stubbornly silent. "What do you want?" I whispered to the painting, feeling foolish, but unable to stop myself from addressing the obvious intelligence behind those painted eyes. The response came not as words, but as a change in the air itself, a heaviness that pressed against my chest, a coldness that had nothing to do with the basement's temperature. And though no voice spoke aloud, I somehow understood what Lord William Gauthier needed from me, what he had been waiting decades for someone to provide. He wanted to finish his prayers. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Lord William Gauthier had died while praying, his final words interrupted by whatever fate had claimed him in 1824. His spirit was trapped in a moment of incomplete devotion, unable to rest until someone finished what death had begun. That night, the sobbing was louder. I could hear it through the rectory walls, a deep, masculine weeping that spoke of desperation accumulated over decades of waiting. When I went down to the basement, the portrait had changed again. This time, dramatically, the nobleman's hands, once folded in serene prayer, were now pressed against his chest, as if trying to contain physical pain. His fingers dug into the painted fabric of his coat with such realistic detail that I could see individual knuckles straining against his skin. His face was twisted in anguish, mouth slightly open, as if caught in the middle of speaking words that would never come. And the tears God help me. The tears were no longer clear. Dark red streaks ran from his eyes like bloody tracks down pale cheeks, pooling on the frame and dripping onto the floor in a steady rhythm that matched the beating of my own terrified heart. I backed away from the portrait, my hands shaking as I fumbled for the light switch. But even as I reached for it, I heard something that froze my blood, a whisper, barely audible but unmistakably real, coming from the direction of the painting. "Help me." The voice was cultured, aristocratic, with the accent of someone educated in an age when pronunciation was an art form. Each word was stretched thin with pain, as if speaking required enormous effort from whatever remained of Lord William Gauthier's consciousness. "Finish my prayer." I should have run. Should have called the bishop or the police or anyone with more authority and less curiosity than a temporary church assistant with too much time and too little sense. Instead, I found myself stepping closer to the portrait, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't resist. "What prayer?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The nobleman's painted eyes shifted, actually moved within the canvas, to focus directly on my face. The impossible physics of it made my vision blur at the edges, but I couldn't look away as those dark pupils tracked my movement with the precision of living sight. "Our Father," he began, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Who art in heaven." The Lord's Prayer. The most basic, most fundamental Christian devotion, something every child learned before they could properly read. But as Lord William spoke those familiar words, I realized what must have happened to him. Death had come in the middle of his final prayers, cutting him off mid-sentence and trapping his soul in an eternal moment of incomplete worship. Without conscious thought, I began to speak along with him. "Hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done." The moment I joined my voice to his, the basement shuddered. Not an earthquake, not the settling of an old building, but something deeper. Reality itself seemed to respond to our combined prayer with a tremor that I felt in my bones. The blood tears flowed faster now, but Lord William's expression began to change. The pain in his painted features started to ease, replaced by something that looked almost like relief. His hands, still pressed against his chest, began to relax their desperate grip. "On earth as it is in heaven," we continued together, his whispered words growing clearer while mine grew more confident. "Give us this day our daily bread." The air in the basement grew thicker with each line, heavy with an energy that made the fluorescent lights flicker and buzz with electrical interference. The temperature dropped so suddenly that our breath began forming visible clouds, but I couldn't stop speaking, wouldn't stop, because I could see what our prayer was doing to the tortured nobleman trapped within the canvas. "And forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us." His painted mouth was moving now, in perfect synchronization with mine, lips forming words with the precision of someone who had been practicing this single prayer for over a century. The blood tears slowed, then stopped entirely, leaving only faint red tracks on his cheeks like the memory of ancient suffering. "And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil." The final line hung in the air between us, weighted with significance that went far beyond simple recitation. Lord William's eyes never left mine as we spoke the concluding words together. "For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever and ever. Amen." The silence that followed was absolute, not just quiet, but the complete absence of sound that comes when the world holds its breath before witnessing something impossible. The moment we spoke that final Amen together, the portrait let out a single, shuddering sigh that seemed to come from depths no painted canvas should possess. The sound was one of pure relief, the exhalation of someone who had been holding their breath for over a century and could finally let it go. Lord William's face returned to its original state of aristocratic composure, but now there was peace where there had been anguish. His hands resumed their proper position of folded prayer, and his eyes, while still unnaturally lifelike, no longer carried the desperate hunger that had made my skin crawl. The blood tears were gone, leaving behind only faint stains on the frame that looked like rust rather than fresh gore. I thought it was over. I thought I had helped a trapped soul find peace and rest. I was wrong. The next morning I found a letter slipped under my office door. Expensive paper, elegant handwriting, sealed with wax that bore the impression of a family crest I didn't recognize. Inside, written in the same cultured script I imagined Lord William would have used in life, was a message that changed everything. Thank you for completing what death interrupted. But completion brings revelation, and revelation demands payment. Look closely at your reflection, Father Mason. Look very closely indeed. Father Mason, that wasn't my name. I was just a temporary assistant, not even ordained clergy. But as I read those words written in handwriting that matched the signature on documents I had never seen, I felt a cold certainty settling into my bones. I walked to the bathroom mirror with legs that felt like lead, each step bringing me closer to a truth I wasn't prepared to face. When I finally looked at my reflection, I saw what Lord William's letter had warned me I would find. My own eyes had changed. They were darker now, deeper, with the intensity that hadn't been there the day before. And when I looked closely, really looked, I could see something else reflected in my pupils, the interior of the basement storage room with the portrait of Lord William Gauthier visible in the background, as if I was looking at myself from inside the painting. The research I conducted over the following weeks revealed truths that I wish I had never learned. Lord William Gauthier hadn't been just any nobleman. He had been accused of practicing forbidden rituals, of attempting to achieve immortality through prayers that perverted sacred words into something blasphemous. The church had tried him in secret in 1824, found him guilty of heresy, and executed him while he was in the middle of reciting what appeared to be the Lord's Prayer, but was actually something far more sinister. Each word I had spoken with him hadn't been helping him find peace. It had been helping him complete the ritual that death had interrupted. And by adding my voice to his, by speaking those perverted prayers in a consecrated space, I had given him what he needed to transfer his consciousness from the canvas prison where it had been trapped for over a century into me. I began to notice the changes immediately. My handwriting shifted, becoming more elegant and archaic. My accent changed, taking on inflections that belonged to another era. My prayers, when I tried to recite them, came out wrong, the words slightly altered, carrying meanings that made my skin crawl even as I spoke them. But the worst part was the portrait itself. Each day, Lord William's painted features looked more and more like my own. It was subtle at first, a slight change in the shape of his nose, a minor adjustment to the set of his mouth. But as weeks passed, the transformation became undeniable. The nobleman in the painting was becoming me while I was becoming him. I tried to destroy the portrait, but every attempt failed. Fire wouldn't touch it. Blades slid off the canvas as if it were made of steel. Water rolled away without leaving so much as a damp spot. The painting was protected by the same force that was slowly consuming my identity from within. 3 months after completing Lord William's prayer, I transferred to another parish without explanation. A year later, I did it again. I've been running ever since, trying to stay ahead of whatever is happening to me, but the changes continue regardless of geography. Because here's the truth that terrifies me most. Sometimes, late at night when I catch my reflection in unexpected mirrors, I see Lord William Gauthier looking back at me from behind my own eyes. And in those moments, I remember things I've never experienced. Memories of experiments with dark prayers, of rituals designed to cheat death, of the moment when church investigators broke down his door and dragged him to his execution. Last month, I received another letter, this one signed with my own name, but written in Lord William's elegant script. The transfer is nearly complete. Soon you will understand what I have learned, that some prayers are answered by powers that demand a very different kind of worship. And the best part? Once the ritual is finished, you'll have eternity to practice getting it right. Looking at my hands as I write this, I can see they're not entirely my own anymore. The fingers are longer, more aristocratic, better suited to the kind of delicate work that forbidden rituals require. And when I look in mirrors now, I have to be very careful about which reflection is looking back. Now get ready, let's start story 7. And if you're already scared, I feel sorry for you because now you're going to die of fear. It started with the howling, a deep, guttural wail that cut through the stillness of St. Benedict's Cemetery like a blade through silence. It wasn't the wind, though that's what I told myself for weeks, before I finally admitted the truth. The sound had a voice, an aching sorrow that rattled my bones every time I heard it echo across the headstones. I had been serving as priest at St. Benedict's Parish in New Hampshire for 3 years when the reports began coming in from locals who lived near the cemetery. They complained of sleepless nights, of something that cried out in the darkness with such profound grief that it made them weep without understanding why. Always around midnight, always from the same location, the unmarked grave in the oldest section of the cemetery. At first, I dismissed their concerns as the overactive imaginations of people who spent too much time alone with their thoughts. Rural New England bred a certain type of superstition, especially among the elderly parishioners who remembered stories their grandparents had told about things that walked in graveyards after dark. But when I started hearing it myself, echoing through the rectory windows like the voice of something that had forgotten how to die properly, I knew I had to investigate. The cemetery was beautiful in daylight. Rolling hills dotted with marble monuments and granite headstones, ancient oak trees providing shade for those who would never need it again. But at night, when fog rolled in from the mountains and settled between the graves like ghostly fingers, the place took on an atmosphere that made even a man of God question what he believed about the boundaries between life and death. The first time I heard the howling clearly was October 15th, 1980. I was locking up the church after evening vespers when the sound rolled across the cemetery like a low, mournful tide. It wasn't animal. I had heard wolves and coyotes during my years in New Hampshire, and this was different. It carried intelligence, purpose, and a desperation that spoke of something trapped between worlds. I grabbed my flashlight and followed the sound, my breath misting in the cold as I walked among the weathered headstones. The howling seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off granite surfaces and distorting until I couldn't pinpoint its source. But as I moved deeper into the cemetery's oldest section, where the stones were cracked and tilted with age, the sound grew stronger. That's when I found the scratches, deep gouges in the damp earth, running along the base of an unmarked stone that was smaller and plainer than the monuments surrounding it. The marks looked like claw marks, but larger than any animal I could identify, long furrows that suggested something with considerable strength had been digging at the ground with desperate persistence. I knelt beside the disturbed earth, running my fingers along the grooves carved into the soil. The dirt was loose, recently turned, as if something had been trying to dig its way out from below. The thought made my stomach clench with unease, but I forced myself to examine the evidence rationally. Probably an animal den, I told myself. Maybe a large dog that had gotten loose and was following scent trails that humans couldn't detect. But animals don't howl with human sorrow, and they don't create perfectly parallel claw marks that show signs of systematic, purposeful digging. The wind shifted, carrying with it a scent that made my nose wrinkle with disgust, something organic and wrong, like meat that had been left too long in warm places. The howling stopped abruptly, leaving behind a silence so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then I heard something much worse than any animal cry. A faint scratching sound, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from beneath the grave. I froze, my flashlight beam wavering as my hands began to shake involuntarily. The scratching was slow but persistent, like fingernails dragging against wood buried under 6 feet of earth. Not the random scrabbling of creatures making burrows, but the methodical sound of something intelligent trying to claw its way through an obstacle. The rational part of my mind insisted this was impossible. Graves don't make sounds. The dead don't scratch at their coffin lids from within. There had to be some logical explanation. Settling earth, tree roots shifting in soil, maybe even underground water movement creating acoustic phenomena I didn't understand. But then came the knocking. 3 deliberate raps from inside the grave, clear and unmistakable, followed by 3 more, then 3 again, as if whatever was down there was trying to communicate, trying to establish contact with the world above. I stumbled backward, my pulse hammering against my ribs like a caged bird desperate for escape. This wasn't natural. This wasn't anything that rational theology or natural science could explain. This was something that challenged every assumption I had made about death, about rest, about the eternal peace that was supposed to come with proper burial and final rites. The knocking came again, more insistent this time, and I could swear I heard something else mixed with the sound. A muffled voice, words too distorted by earth and wood to understand, but unmistakably human in their cadence. I should have run. Every instinct screamed at me to get as far away from that unhallowed sound as possible and never return to the cemetery after dark. Instead, I found myself walking to the caretaker's shed with mechanical determination, my hands moving of their own accord as I selected a shovel from the tool rack. The metal felt cold and heavy in my grip, but somehow familiar, as if I had been preparing for this moment without knowing it. The scratching from below grew more frantic as I returned to the unmarked grave, and the knocking became a steady rhythm. 3 raps, pause, 3 raps, pause, like a heartbeat that refused to stop, even in death. I began to dig. The earth was loose, recently disturbed, despite the fact that no one should have been working in this section of the cemetery. My shovel cut through the soil with ease, as if something had already tried to break free from below and loosened the dirt in the process. The deeper I went, the stronger the smell became, not just decay, but something else, something that reminded me of copper and fear. 3 feet down, the rhythmic knocking stopped. 6 feet down, my shovel hit wood with a hollow thud that echoed strangely in the narrow grave. I cleared away the remaining dirt with shaking hands, revealing a coffin that was old and warped with moisture, its once polished surface now grey and cracked with age. But the lid was already open. Not completely, just a gap wide enough for skeletal fingers to protrude, curled around the edge of the casket, as if whoever was inside had been trying to push their way out. The fingers were long and pale, with fragments of rotting burial cloth still clinging to the bones like tattered skin. I should have covered the grave back up, should have called the police or the coroner or anyone with more authority and better equipment to deal with whatever I had uncovered. But something about those fingers, about the desperate way they gripped the coffin's edge, compelled me to lift the lid completely. Inside was a skeleton, twisted in unnatural positions, its limbs contorted, as if the person had died in the middle of a violent struggle. The skull was tilted back at an impossible angle, jaw hanging open in what might have been a scream or a howl. But what made my stomach lurch with horror was the evidence of what had happened to this person before death claimed them. The bones showed signs of having been broken and reset multiple times. The ribs were cracked in patterns that suggested repeated trauma, and wrapped around the skeleton's throat were the corroded remains of a metal collar, its surface green with age, but still recognizable as some kind of restraint device. This person hadn't just died. They had been tortured, imprisoned, treated like an animal, until death became a mercy they were finally allowed to receive. But the worst discovery was what I found clutched in the skeleton's other hand, a strip of fabric that had once been white but was now stained dark with something that looked like dried blood. Embroidered into the cloth in thread that had somehow survived the decades were words in Latin that made my blood run cold. Excommunicatus, damnatus, oblitus, excommunicated, damned, forgotten, As I read those words aloud, the wind picked up suddenly, howling through the cemetery with a voice that was no longer entirely natural. The sound carried within it the same anguish I had been hearing for weeks, but now I could understand what it was trying to communicate. This wasn't just the cry of a restless spirit. This was the voice of someone who had been denied every comfort that death was supposed to bring, denied last rites, denied proper burial, denied even the basic dignity of being remembered by name. The unmarked grave, the evidence of torture, the excommunication cloth, all of it pointed to someone who had been condemned not just to death, but to eternal suffering. The skeleton's jaw moved, impossible though it was, creaking open wider as if trying to voice words that decayed vocal cords could no longer form. And then, carried on wind that tasted of copper and earth, I heard it clearly for the first time. "I'm not done." The voice was low, ragged, speaking words in an accent that belonged to centuries past. But there was intelligence in it, purpose, and a determination that death had only made stronger. "I'm not done," it repeated, and this time the skeleton's empty eye sockets seemed to focus on my face with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Not finished, not forgiven, not free. A sudden gust of wind filled the grave, swirling dirt and debris around the exposed coffin like a miniature tornado. The skeleton's bones rattled against each other with sounds like breaking twigs, and its jaw continued to move in rhythm with words I could barely hear, but somehow understood. It was reciting something, not prayers, but accusations, names, dates, crimes that had never been properly punished, a litany of injustice that stretched back decades, maybe centuries, delivered in the voice of someone who refused to let death silence their testimony. The accusations poured from the skeleton's impossible voice like water from a broken dam, each name and crime delivered with the precision of someone who had been rehearsing this testimony for decades. I heard tales of corruption that reached into the highest levels of the church hierarchy, of money stolen from the poor, of children harmed by those who should have protected them. And I understood why this person had been excommunicated, tortured, and buried without name or marker. They hadn't been a heretic or a criminal. They had been a whistleblower, someone who had tried to expose truths that powerful people wanted buried along with the evidence. "Father Marcus Whitmore," the skeleton spoke, and somehow I knew that was his name, the identity that had been stripped from him along with his life. Tried to speak truth, silenced for it, buried alive for it, buried alive. The words hit me like a physical blow as I realized what the broken bones and twisted posture really meant. Father Whitmore hadn't died from torture and then been buried. He had been placed in this coffin while still breathing, still conscious, still trying to claw his way free as the earth was shoveled over his grave. "They thought death would silence me," he continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "But some testimonies transcend flesh. Some truths refuse to stay buried." Nertin, the wind around the grave intensified, carrying with it sounds that made my teeth ache. Voices from the past, echoes of conversations that had taken place in secret rooms, where men in religious robes decided who lived and who died based on how much their silence was worth. "Will you listen?" Father Whitmore asked, his empty sockets fixed on mine with desperate intensity. "Will you carry the testimony they tried to bury?" I wanted to say no. Wanted to cover this grave back up, transfer to another parish, pretend I had never heard the names he was speaking or the crimes he was describing. But there was something in his voice, not just desperation, but hope. The first hope he had been allowed to feel in over a century. "Yes," I whispered, and the moment the word left my lips, I felt something change inside my chest, a weight settling there, heavy and warm, like swallowing a coal that would burn forever without being consumed. Father Whitmore's skeleton relaxed, the bones settling into more natural positions, as if death was finally claiming him properly. "Thank you," he breathed, and his voice was already fading, growing distant, as whatever force had animated him began to dissipate. The truth lives now in you. Don't let them bury it again." The wind died suddenly, leaving the cemetery in absolute silence. The skeleton became just bones again, empty and still, holding no more animation than any other remains that had been properly laid to rest. But the weight in my chest remained, along with the memories of every name and crime Father Whitmore had recited. I filled in the grave that night, working by flashlight until the earth was level and unmarked once again. But I couldn't bury what I had learned, couldn't forget the testimony that now lived within me like a second heartbeat. The research I conducted over the following months confirmed everything Father Whitmore had told me. The names were real, the crimes documented in archives that most people never saw, the cover-ups meticulously planned and executed by men who valued institutional reputation over justice. But here's what terrifies me most. The weight in my chest has been growing heavier each year. Sometimes I catch myself speaking in Father Whitmore's voice, using phrases and accents that belong to his century rather than mine. And lately, I've started having dreams where I'm the one buried alive, clawing at wooden lid while earth rains down from above, because I'm beginning to understand that carrying his testimony isn't just about preserving truth, it's about becoming him. The same force that kept his consciousness burning for over a century is now working on me, transforming me into the next vessel for accusations that refuse to die. Last month, I felt the first scratch marks appearing on my bedroom door, 4 parallel gouges that match the ones I found at his gravesite 40 years ago. And when I wake up in the morning, there's dirt under my fingernails, despite the fact that I haven't been near the cemetery in days. The howling has started again, but now it's coming from inside my own throat. And when I look in mirrors, sometimes I see Father Whitmore's face looking back at me, his mouth moving in silent recitation of truths that still need speaking. The cycle continues. The testimony passes from one keeper to the next. And somewhere, in another cemetery in another state, there's probably a priest just like me, hearing impossible sounds from an unmarked grave and making the choice that will define what remains of his mortal life. Truth doesn't die. It just finds new voices to speak through, and once you've heard it, you can never really be silent again. These 12 testimonies come from men who dedicated their lives to serving God, yet encountered something that challenged everything they believed about death, salvation, and the boundaries between worlds. Each priest I interviewed asked the same question. Have you felt it too? That presence just beyond sight? Because here's what they all discovered. Once you've heard these stories, once you've opened your mind to these possibilities, you become part of the testimony, you become a witness. And witnesses are never really alone. If these true horror stories have followed you into your thoughts, consider sending a super thanks. Your support doesn't just maintain the channel, it helps uncover the darkest stories that would otherwise remain buried. The next person to send super thanks will receive a hidden epilogue to Story 12 in the Community tab. Subscribe for more true horror encounters that blur the line between faith and fear. Turn on notifications, because some stories refuse to stay buried. And if you're still brave enough, the next video is waiting for you.